After statement of intent, there was an opportunity for shareholder comment, and now we're just assessing their response to those shareholder comments. We've also had all that consultation on the LTP, the RLTP, and the Auckland Plan 2050. So there's been a lot of opportunities, and Auckland Transport had to deal with a lot of inputs into their program. So therefore, we do recommend that you approve their statement of intent. However, we are sufficiently concerned that, as you can see, I think it's recommendation B, that we do send Auckland Transport a letter which just responds to their invitation to us to work with them and confirms that we're interested in doing that. And I think that that letter shouldn't just cover the roads and streets framework, which is mentioned in the recommendation, but also working with them on the measures, working with them on their response to climate change, and inviting them to workshop that with us sometime before the end of the calendar year. I think that's all I need to say about Auckland Transport. Look forward to the discussion.
Right, anything else, Alistair?
Should we do the CCO at a time?
Yeah,
Would
I think so. I think we should. Look, I'm going to move the recommendations just to put them on the table for discussion. Do a second. Thank you, Councillor Cooper. So questions on Auckland Transport. We have Councillor Cashmore, Councillor Fletcher, Councillor Darby, Councillor Casey.
Thanks very much, team. Excuse me, and particularly Ed. With the amount of uncertainty that's floating around, a couple of questions, because this has made Auckland Transport's job quite difficult, trying to allocate a work program when you don't know how deep your tin is. So when will we get an idea of the first, say, quarter of the fuel tax, what that's actually going to be worth to the city? And the second question is the GPS2, when that lands, and do we have any understanding what that may involve at this stage from government?
I can't give you a specific answer on the fuel tax. We're working closely with Auckland Transport to figure out how the reporting for RFT will work. And GPS2, I'll have to come back to you, Councillor. I'm sorry, I don't know the answer to that.
Right. So the point I'd make, Madam Chair, some of these things could actually change what Auckland Transport's trying to achieve. And there's a degree of uncertainty still around the light rail, third tracking, electrification and so forth. That all needs to be land because none of it is currently funded.
I think ongoing discussions are going to be key to that. So thank you, Councillor. Councillor Fletcher.
Oh, thank you, Madam Chair. This is the time in the cycle where we really, as governors, want to be able to interrogate this, because once we sign off on this, really we're giving the marching orders to Auckland Transport to achieve those things we want. So notwithstanding what the Deputy Mayor has just said, and I concur that there's a whole lot of uncertainties in terms of things that need to land, I want to bring it back to something that you might consider of less importance, but the response that we've had on a regular basis from Auckland Transport has been quite woolly, in my opinion, on the issue of gating. We have raised it, we have discussions when we meet informally, and this is not a new issue. I see that in their response to us, to the Mayor's letter of expectation, they talk about rail station gating, complete current program with gates installed at Papakura and Glen Innes to avoid fare evasion before begin planning the next tranche of station gates. Well, they've begun the next tranche of station gates now for some years, and I just wonder whether we could expect a little more on that, because we know that fare evasion is occurring. We also know that that can be at the heart of other less desirable elements, and gating is an effective measure. I would like to see us beef that up. They've had this response for some time. I think it's unacceptable. I accept that they've got a whole range of other things that are yet to land, but that's something over which they can have control. So, Ed, do you want to comment, or Alistair, on that specific measure?
I don't have to hand the details about their gating program. That it is in one of the capital program documents, and I can get you an answer on what the program actually is. As to whether it should be included in the statement of intent itself, at this time, I'd probably recommend that something of that level of detail shouldn't go in the statement of intent. But obviously,
I would normally
decision.
agree with you, and in perhaps my own consistency in the past. It's a more general level. But where there has been a failure to progress an issue that Council has raised on a regular basis, how would you suggest we approach it? Because this is our opportunity to have that discussion really with Auckland Transport.
With the indulgence of the chair, this could be one of the issues that would be covered off formally in a letter sent from council to the board as per the recommendation. We can say, look, we're expecting to see greater progress made on this, and we expect to see regular reporting against this in the quarterly reporting. This is a performance issue, but I take your point that unless we send a strong signal when we're finalising these statements of intent, then we sort of lose it at that end. So I'd suggest that we include that as one of the comments in a letter to go to the Auckland Transport Board, and that it's picked up regularly by yourself at the quarterly reporting sessions we have with Auckland Transport.
Well, Madam Chair, I appreciate the response from Alistair on that, and I think it's prudent to do that. But I just remind colleagues that Auckland Transport are dealing with so many large strategic issues that some of these things that actually make a difference in people's lives get overlooked. And if we are to have accountability on those matters that we have tracked constantly, I want to find some way that we can tick them off. So I accept Alice's proposal. And there are one or two other issues, but gating is one that for the last 7 years, we've chewed the fat on.
So for today, we can add some other subject matter to B as by way of resolution. And I think we have a workshop coming up in a few weeks where we start this process again with Auckland Transport. Maybe we also discuss it there and formally do it in the initial, letters of expectation for next year.
Madam Chair, and I appreciate that, and there are one or two other matters. I don't want to monopolise the time of this meeting, but particularly in the area of parking and policy and delivery and implementation, I feel that their response has been inadequate, and I would like the opportunity for some of these things to be formally dealt with.
Maybe with your indulgence, Madam Chair, if we change recommendation B to something along the lines of, and hopefully Kalinda, this will make sense, agree that a letter be sent to Auckland Transport outlining the concerns of this committee regarding the Auckland Transport statement of intent. The content of this letter to be agreed or finalised by the chair and deputy chair of this committee. Would that be sensible?
And I'm happy to work with the acting chair of the committee for this. Auckland Transport are dealing with so many, monumental issues, big sexy issues, but that should not be at the expense of the functionality of the general program.
Point taken, and I think that's a good solution. Thank you, Alistair.
Thank you.
Councillor Darby.
Thank you. And following on from that, and thanks, Chair, for considering my email of yesterday, raising concern particularly about the Auckland Transport SOI, which the staff have looked at as well. I do have significant concerns about the Auckland Transport SOI. Now, in the introduction, Ed, you've outlined why those gaps are there. I guess I just want to make the point that should have been contained within the report itself. It's not contained within the report why those gaps are there. So I want to make that point clear. Chair, this whole SOI process, we need to stop and take a totally new look at this. This started in November, December, when this committee confirmed the directions of the LOEs, the letters of expectation. They went out in January. There was a supplementary. And then it's this long process. But there's this stage where, and I'm getting to a question, there's a stage where you confirm a whole lot of other things, like the RLTP, the Regional Land Transport Plan. You confirm a 10-year budget, and you confirm, this year at least, an Auckland Plan 2050 refresh. And none of that is accurately reflected in the SOI. So an SOI is supposed to be about the objectives and intentions for the next 3 years. ATs is about 1 year, And even on that front, it doesn't reflect the higher ranking documents. So first question, Chair, is what are we going to do to ensure that the process of confirming SOIs is streamlined and that it is timed to be able to respond to the documents that it should respond to? That's the key question here. Having said that, I note that other CCOs have managed to reflect largely those higher ranking documents. So what is the intention? What are our learnings out of this? There's got to be a substantial change. I'm all ears, Alistair.
Alistair.
Look, first of all, I take your point that we didn't cover off in the report those issues about why that detail is not in the Auckland Transport Statement of Intent. That's my responsibility. I acknowledge that and I apologise for it. The SOI process is largely constrained by the timeframes in the legislation, and in past years it runs rather uncomfortably alongside annual plans and LTPs where things aren't always in alignment. Now, at a staff level we kind of make that work behind the scenes, but it's not ideal with the timing. This year, I think the big hiccup probably did come with Auckland Transport and the RLTP, and in effect they landed version 2.0 later in the piece because version 1.0 wasn't quite what we were wanting. So that didn't work. What could we do differently? A few things here. At a bigger picture level, I don't think this will progress at any pace, but DIA at a staff level have had some discussions with us at a staff level about what changes could be made to the Local Government Act in regards to CCO statements of intent and accountabilities. One of the suggestions that I made was that we aren't held to such rigorous timeframes, that we can in fact just agree with our CCOs what those timeframes are to give ourselves that flexibility. I think one thing that we could and possibly should suggest to the CCOs is that instead of being tied to the tyranny of board meeting deadlines, that they put in place some delegations so that they have a bit more flexibility at their end as to how and when they can sign off stuff. And potentially we could do the same at our end. We're very much tied to committee timeframes that fit inside the legislative timeframes, and it compresses everything and makes it all very awkward. I think there's potentially other things that we can do without going too far off the reservation here. The statement of intent process feels very much like an exchange of correspondence between staff that goes to our respective governors for approval at various stages of the process. How can we get a more direct engagement between yourselves and the boards, right from an expectations, rather than being a letter of expectation, a chat about expectations, through to an actual discussion about shareholder feedback rather than being by way of letter. I think these could be ways of increasing engagement in the statement of intent process, but also with appropriate delegations in place, giving a bit more flexibility around the timing. I think by and large the regime around statements of intent was designed for CCOs that actually make you money. It works far better with the likes of ACIL and now Ports of Auckland, where it's not so much tied into your big strategic planning processes like the LTP. It's more of a discussion about, well, how much money are you guys going to give us? Oh, great, thank you. When we're dealing with CCOs which are delivering pretty core council services and are part of bigger strategic planning processes, I think that the Local Government Act process is a bit clunky and doesn't quite work. So, look, my suggestions are around increasing delegations at both ends of the process, at at your end, so nominating of some of the councillors to be more heavily involved in specific CCOs, but also at the CCO board end process, them delegating to whoever the chair and whatever to finalise these documents, to give a bit more slip in the time frames. Otherwise, we just get horribly caught.
Okay, so I think, look, one thing I've learned out of doing a number of SOIs now is the laborious nature of the process. So I'm wondering, Chair, this time we need to say from this committee that staff undertake a review of the SOI process. And I think we don't need to go further than that, because otherwise we get bogged down in detail itself. But I'm wondering if there's a willingness from the mover and seconder just to add that we call for that review of process.
I'm very, very happy about that, and we'll get something drafted up. And I think actually, Alistair, what you've said is very valid, and I think the workshop, as you know, on this is literally only about a month away anyway. And I think that will give the rest of us a little bit of time. I think you've raised a really valid point, Councillor, and it'll give the rest of us a little bit of time to think about our input into that as well, that we can discuss with you. And also just on the letter to Auckland Transport, certainly we'll draft up with input from everybody and then circulate it out before it goes as well. So thank you.
So just on the Auckland Transport one, if it doesn't reflect the RLTP, the 10-year budget, the Auckland Plan 2050, doesn't reflect the supplementary letter asking them to address climate change, doesn't reflect the original letter on addressing disposal of assets and involving Panuku, doesn't reflect, as I can see, the implementation of the actions of the governance framework, doesn't reflect our request for them to address stormwater management, doesn't reflect road safety to the degree that they have now confirmed work plans. So if the SOI's job is to outline the objectives and activities of the Auckland Transport for the next 3 years, it only has a 1-year work plan and doesn't reflect everything I've just highlighted, how is it worthy of being approved today?
Dealing with all of those individually is a bit difficult. There is a 1-year work program, and I guess it was a judgment call on our part, and it's your decision whether you agree with that or not, that the 3-year work program is contained in the RLTP. So it's contained somewhere in a statutory document, just not in the SOI, and that was largely for timing reasons. A lot of those other issues, I think the road safety one's a good one, Councillor Darby, where they've made decisions earlier this year which could be better reflected in the statement of intent. Other issues like responding to the climate change letter of expectation that went out earlier this year, they haven't done the thinking in that regard and want to workshop that with you as a governing body to discuss what their response could be and should be there. So I think, why is it worthy of approval today? I think fundamentally it does reflect the decisions made in the LTP and the RLTP for the first year, and we will have an opportunity to flesh out the further work program with the next statement of intent. So I guess the issue for you to consider as a committee is, do we go through a formal modification process so that they update the current statement of intent so that it fleshes these things out in a bit more detail for the current year, or are you happy to wait for the next statement of intent?
We've done that before.
Where that stuff will come through.
So, Councillor, you're right. Every 3 years, the cycle gets out of kilter. The process gets out of kilter with other things that happen. And I think the fact that you've put up a resolution, Resolution F, will actually flesh out some of those problems around that, hopefully.
It would help if I can ask, be include the mayor's office. I think the mayor's office needs to be
He signs it, so,
to be agreed by the mayor, chair, and deputy chair.
absolutely, okay, over there. Thank you, councillor. Councillor Casey.
Oh, thank you for the opportunity, Madam Chair, just to discuss an issue. We go from huge issues like the CRL down to individual passenger trips, and it's the individual passenger trip I'd like to talk about today and to see whether this committee could impact, because this is one of the few tools we have to influence the direction of Auckland Transport. And there is no doubt everybody in this room supports the rollout of the new bus network to make buses faster, more frequent, and to go where they want to go. But in July, we also agreed to be an age-friendly city, and I'm about to marry up these two. And I'm with Councillor Darby. The statement of intent process needs to be more responsive to the changes that we make as a council. So to marry up these two things, I'd like to talk about the 650 bus service, which is currently depositing older people outside the Green Lane Clinical Centre and leaving them either 274 metres to walk or 312 metres to walk. And this is just unacceptable. And I've read the justifications Auckland Transport have made that it takes 5 minutes off the journey, and there are 500 people on that bus who don't go to the clinical centre. But I can guarantee you, if you ask those 500 people, would you mind if this bus took another 5 minutes to get older people inside the Green Lane Clinical Centre, the 500 people would say yes. So here's the dilemma. We've supported the rollout, and I mean, I've had emails about the western rollout and the central rollout, but nothing as absolutely clear-cut, black and white wrong as this. Absolutely not. You cannot deposit older people outside the clinical centre. So we're writing a letter to Auckland Transport about all these grand plans that we've discussed already, and they've had chance to input, but in the sense that we've changed our tack with regard to an age-friendly city, which means we put older people first, or at least include their views in our decision-making. And if you look to our page, where are we? Our page 36, and I do want you to look at this. Halfway through the page, as part of this SOI, Auckland Transport talks about accessibility improvements, and one of those improvements is to deliver safety improvements for the first and last leg of public transport journeys. Now, the last leg of the public transport journey to Green Lane Clinical Centre for many older people is to be deposited a long way away from the facility, which is an accident waiting to happen. So it's counter to what we're asking Auckland Transport to do in their SOI. So long story short, I think this is wrong. I think we have an opportunity here to say that. I can't imagine anybody in this room would think it's appropriate. And that the rollout is brilliant, but you have to tailor it to suit the needs of older people. And in this case, absolutely, the bus needs to go in, as it used to do until very recently, into the clinical centre. And it's not just older people, it's anyone who has a disability, anybody who has difficulty walking needs to be taken into the centre, not left outside. So I'm seeking your indulgence, Madam Chair, to raise this issue in the letter to Auckland Transport.
Right. I think that certainly the age-friendly city statement can be put in that letter, and as I've said, I will circulate the letter for input. You do know, don't you, that Auckland Transport are reviewing that bus network 3 months after its implementation on July 8. Yep. And I hope that you're talking directly with them about this issue, because they have promised that should there be any immediate obvious blips, that they will change that at the 3-month point. And I know that there are a number in the central network. You've highlighted a big one, but there are certainly a number around schools as well. So we will outline that in the letter, but I also think that the resolution F, this isn't just about letter to letter, it's got to be about engagement and about speaking to Auckland Transport and having a better understanding between both governors. And I think the more that we can engage with them early on this issue, the better. So yes, I'm happy to include it, Councillor. Councillor Walker, Wayne Walker.
Sure. I just want to raise a matter that was raised in an earlier statement of intent by the council a couple of years ago. This particularly goes to regional facilities, and it's around transparency, and in particular a greater measure.
Sorry, Councillor, we're doing Auckland Transport at the moment. Is this the Auckland Transport question?
No, I wasn't aware that we were
Sorry.
specific to a particular. I'll come back to that.
We'll just stick with Auckland Transport because that seems to be a bit of a. Do you mind? And we'll hold your
No,
one
that's
for the
fine.
next time. Councillor Cooper.
Actually, I'll leave, I think some of the things that I wanted to say have been said. I won't repeat.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Hills.
Yes, thank you. I agree with a lot of what has been said, that this feels not quite on the transformational place where everything else in context has been and is. And there is some fantastic work going on, don't get me wrong, but I feel a little bit whelmed by some of the details in here. But just 2 points, and I wonder if, where is it? We have a roads and streets resolution, or is that gone now?
No, we've decided because it's going to be wider than just roads and streets to leave the letter wide, and our input will be on issues that Councillor Fletcher, Casey, etc., and Darby have raised.
Yeah, so it was, I guess, for me, just commenting on that then. So the review of roads and streets, I feel like we're constantly saying review this when it's done, it's complete. What was the point of, it should just be implemented. So that's my view, that it should just be implemented. It's a very clear document, very good document. And the other one around ferries, progress the development of a ferry strategy for Auckland. Like this has been, we've been told that it's happening, or it's nearly ready, or the ferry strategy's going along. Why are we progressing the development of one? It should just be either already happening, or, it's just, it needs to hurry up a little bit. And the end of journey facilities, I've had a lot of feedback lately around safety and around lighting, around how people feel on the getting from the bus to wherever, or there's a lot more we can be doing on that whole of journey. It's not just when you stop at the bus stop or whatever, or get off the train. It's actually how you get to your work or your... So I think we need to be thinking a little bit wider, especially around how people feel around that safety measure in Auckland. So I don't know how we implement that, but that's just another thing there. Yeah, I mean, generally there's lots of good in here, but I feel like we aren't quite punching the bits we need to just move forward and do. Thank you.
Councillors, I'm getting the impression that there's a lot here. I think what we might do is ask councillors to put forward their suggestions to Auckland Transport over and above the statements of intent. Bullet point them, send them to me, we'll send them to Auckland Transport, and in that first workshop we'll be able to actually spend a bit more time on those as well. I mean, because after all, with the greatest of respect, these statements of intent are letter to letter. The actual issue is really communication and doing the real business, and that's, the more that we do that face to face, I think the better it is for everybody.
All right.
So thank you, Councillor. Councillor Fletcher.
Oh, thank you, Madam Chair. Just following on from that, I just seek clarity, and I welcome the open way in which you have been working to put forward recommendations that reflect the mood of the meeting. But F is, I think, desirable, but the primary concerns that I've got relate in terms of the process specific to Auckland Transport. So I think it's important we have a system that relates to all of our major substantive CCOs. But on B, my concern is around the accountability that we're seeking there, and I think it's good to have the Mayor and yourself and Councillor Clow involved in actually pulling this together. But what is the role with the Appointments, Accountability and Value for Money Committee? On the one hand, we're wanting our directors of substantive CCOs to understand the importance of these documents. You know, that they are not just sitting on the board of Auckland Transport waiting for officers telling them what to do. We are expecting the directors of our CCOs to act as, the directors in terms of implementing those things that, in the right model for a CCO. I'm a great supporter of CCOs, because if we're operating them effectively, it's a very efficient way to deliver council's objectives. But what we've had for quite some time now is some dissatisfaction with the level of interest, and maybe I'm just speaking for myself, by directors in some of these things that council has been consistently putting forward. So I'd like to know, from an officer perspective perhaps, or from yourself, where you see the interface with the appointments committee, the appointments and accountability, where that dovetails with this committee, the finance committee, and whether there's a role there in terms of making sure that officers are working, maybe Alistair would like to comment on it, just how this work program, where they report to this committee and they also report to the appointments committee, just how B will in practice work.
Alistair.
Sure, if Alistair would like to respond to that. It sounds dangerously political in its answer, because I think that fundamentally comes down to committee structure. So I might give that one a polite swerve, if you don't mind. But I think
Thank
that,
you, Alistair.
yeah, look, I think...
If it's of assistance, I don't mean for this to be political. All I'm interested in is that we want accountability, and we want the best performance from our substantive CCOs. And Auckland Transport have had a few little glitches along the way, and I'm just wanting to know at what point, especially if we're going into a process of the appointment of a new director for Auckland Transport, where all this work comes together.
Yeah, and I think I feel safe commenting on that. It is slightly challenging, because what we consistently measure CCO performance on is statement of intent and LTP KPIs, and by and large that isn't where the problems are. The problems are in more specific projects, or in how a CCO might have engaged on a particular project in a particular community, and that is often being discussed at separate committees. Not always this one, never at the appointments committee, so that might be happening at planning or the environment and community committee, or nobody's picking it up. So I think there is issue around, all right, well, what are causing the genuine niggles with CCOs? If it's not delivery against a KPI, then it's not being actively monitored, if you like, by our team and the finance team. And I think one of the issues that we need to look at collectively is how we pick up those issues that are being discussed in other committees and feed them through, so that they can be communicated appropriately to the board and discussed at times when we're looking at director reappointments and new appointments.
Thank you for that, Madam Chair, and I think Alistair's response is good, and we just need to capture that in the way that we are moving forward.
Thank you, Councillor.
And have it recorded.
Thank you. I think Matthew's got something to add as well.
So through the Chair, the other piece that I wanted to add in, and we've talked about coming together in September, first quarterly reporting will be October, and so I think we should see the opportunity with transport in particular for you to put some thought in and get clear about, in some areas quite precisely, the things you expect them to report back on in the first quarter. So while this is a bit awkward because we potentially wait for another year to go by and that sits a bit uncomfortably, I'd encourage you to grab the quarterly reporting and take the opportunity to be very clear with them what you expect to see coming back, and we can get we can kind of get a wriggle on with that now. I mean, their executive are expecting quarterly reporting to be fairly focused, but I think you will all have particular issues which have sat there for a while. This is an opportunity to elevate them and make that clear.
Madam Chair, I think that's very good advice. Unfortunately, too often when we go through this process, it's more a perfunctory one. I think what Matthew is suggesting with the quarterly reporting is that we take the opportunity, we probably can't do all of them, but to do a deep dive into one of them. And I really welcome the suggestion that we can do a deep dive into Auckland Transport on some of these areas that have been raised by way of concern today.
And we'll give you a bit of notice on that too, as I've said, you know, so you can send your comments and questions through. Councillor, Deputy Mayor, sorry.
Matthew's actually just pretty much said exactly, I was going to say the same thing, is, you know, statements of intent, memorandums of understanding are high-level principle documents about giving direction. A lot of what's been said today is more on the detail. I prefaced my earlier comments about there has been an inability for AT to deliver detail because of GPS statements and different budget constraints that they just did not know in which world they were at. Where we need to dive to the detail, and I think Matthew's actually hit the nail perfectly on the head, is in those quarterly reporting. We have, I think it's 3 hours with them quarterly, and that's a good opportunity to talk with management and directors about your concerns as a representative of your area, whether it's Kathy's bus route for the people, whether it's Chris's delivering of the safety program, or whatever. I've got 5 things listed down here that concern me. So I suggest, Madam Chair, that we have the ability that these items of our concern be given to you prior to that quarterly meeting, and that be relayed to the CE of Auckland Transport as part of the issues we want discussed, because it is a huge part of our budget, it is a huge part of our work, and we do need to perform better. We've replaced virtually half of the board, new CE is the new senior management. It is a time now for us to insert our wishes on that professional board to a degree that is acceptable and agreeable amongst the parties.
Thanks for supporting that, my suggestion. That's great. Thank you. Okay, so is that all on Auckland Transport? Fantastic. Let's now move on to the other CCOs. I think because Auckland Transport has been so contentious, I think we can take questions then on any of the other CCOs, and Councillor Wayne Walker, you're first up.
Well, just wanted to raise an issue that particularly goes to regional facilities, and that follows from an earlier statement of intent a couple of years ago, which was focused around higher level of transparency. And my question especially goes to the importance of breaking RFA's facilities down into cost and revenue centres, so that we've got information, better information around Aotea Centre, around the zoo, around particular stadiums. That goes to revenue and expenditure, and also renewals and capital. That enables us to compare apples with apples. For example, if there's a discussion around Eden Park and some concerns there, the way our stadiums are being treated can then be adequately compared. Right now, we don't have that oversight. Councillors would know that there is a substantial amount of capital that gets put into almost all of these facilities, and also operationally a top-up in terms of money as well. They're not necessarily standalone, that's for sure. So I would put that plea. I don't doubt that the Chief Executive has picked up on that. Equally, that also applies to Panuku, where you can identify cost and revenue centres, particularly around large projects, so that we have some oversight over them.
Alistair?
And this is partly tied in with the discussion around quarterly reporting. Ed, you might be able to confirm, I think RFA is reporting on a business unit. Oh, sorry.
Yes, they are. So on the final pages of RFA's statement of intent, for the first time, we have actually got financial reporting by business unit. Now, that doesn't go to the level of stadium by stadium or facility by facility, and I think my advice is that that's actually appropriate. That's not, we shouldn't expect to get the detail. That is the CCO's role to deal with those facilities at that level. But we do have the business unit information now, which is a first and is to be commended, I think.
First time.
And I
Through you,
think,
Madam Chair, I would suggest that it is important that we have information on some of these cost and revenue centres which are substantial. There are decisions being made around the application of capital and money into various stadia, into things like the zoo, the art gallery, for example. We had a big discussion around that. And particularly when it comes to a number of these venues, there is significant public ownership of those venues. Often there are issues around philanthropy that go to some of these venues as well, and I would suggest there is much more need for transparency. I would suggest that RFA, for example, already has this information. It has to have information around cost and revenue centres to run those centres well. So it's not as though there's any additional effort on their part.
So, Councillor, I think what I'm hearing from staff, and I hear your concerns, I think, again, just as in Auckland Transport, you furnish your questions in advance, that RFA will be able to answer your questions within the framework of their quarterly reporting. All right? Thank you. Any other questions on any of the other CCO SIs? Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's probably, to Alistair or even to Matthew, this is about water care and their ability for the flexible models to help deliver the critical infrastructure that has to be done. So I'm not talking about collaboration with Three Waters and also CIP, CI, etc. So it talks around that here, but there's nothing definitive around that. Is that a discussion also for the quarterly meetings, or in the future do we need to have a KPI that's more stringent around that?
So, I mean, I think there's kind of a few different things tied up in that area. So, if we're talking about sort of collaboration between the council and Watercare on the Three Waters front,
It says that.
Yeah. So I think that is happening, and there's good progress. You know, particularly around sort of implementing some of those Section 17A recommendations and in their participation in the water strategy, as you well know. I think when it comes to the CI, I would defer to Matthew to comment on that, because he's more sort of closely involved in that.
So through the chair, I think as an SOI document, I think it's fine. I think it reflects those things adequately. So in a sense, that's the board talking to you, and I think they capture direction in a way that lets us operate with executive. So I'm quite comfortable with it, Deputy Mayor. I think it gives us enough to work with, and we continue to work with them on all of those projects at the moment.
Right.
I'll take that assurance, but I will be bringing it up at the quarterly.
At the quarterly, yeah.
Yep.
Councillor Darby.
Thank you. On a brighter note, I was quite impressed by the Panuku statement of intent. And while others may not have grabbed the opportunity of our recent decisions, it's clear to me that Panuku have. And they have a vision for their work. And I was quite taken by this moniker, shaping spaces for Aucklanders to love. And it just sparked with me, and I think it'll spark with Aucklanders. But I have been critical, Chair of AT's SOI, but I am not critical of Panuku's. I think Panuku have grabbed the future that we've indicated through a lot of decisions in recent months, and they're running with it. Watercare, I also think are running with it, and they are addressing climate change, so they've managed to respond to the supplementary letter. And I have one question with Watercare, and I'm just wondering if this is the time, and I'll take your guidance. I have raised before the fact that the infrastructure growth charge, which applies to all new connections, despite what Watercare say on their own page about the IGC not having an impact on existing ratepayers, existing water ratepayers and future generations, the IGC does, because it's subsidised. It's subsidised to the tune of 30%. It's also not clear to me how the rationale for how they've arrived at the IGC as it applies to standalone remote 4-bedroom home somewhere and 70-metre efficient apartment city centre or a metro centre. So with your willingness again, Chair, I'm wondering if we might accept a G, that Watercare examine and report back to Council on the rationale for its current infrastructure growth IGC charges, particularly the subsidy level of the IGC.
Yeah, do you think that, I mean, I don't disagree with you, but do you think that is a resolution, well, I'm thinking potentially it's not a resolution for this. I think it is actually something that you should, in advance, like there's a common thread here. We're all saying, I mean, the staff have said, actually the statements of intent are fine. With Auckland Transport, there needs to be a secondary letter. What we're all saying for every CCO pretty much is there are some questions and some concerns we have about their business, and we would like some more information on that. So to that end, instead of asking just for maybe your feedback on Auckland Transport, which we will start these discussions in the next month, that maybe we ask for some points for every CCO. Councillor Wayne Walker has brought some up on RFA, and maybe we have those in advance and then have the conversation, because this item is really about the general statements of intent, all right? The specifics on certain issues, I think, can be covered separately. Well, that's just my take on it. If other councillors share that.
I accept that. I'm raising it, and I'll take it up with Chief Financial. And the points that, other than the other points I've made, that is the only point that is not reflected in the letters of expectation. Everything else I've raised is not new business. It's not about some lower, if I can say, level operational issue. Everything I've raised was either in the LOE, in the supplementary letter, or the initial feedback. It's not new information.
No, you make a good point. And thank you for your positivity. It's very easy to throw stones, isn't it? But it's nice to have some positive responses back. Look, to that end, I'll just add, I'm going to make sure that those emails, why this is really sort of fresh in everyone's thinking, we'll get those emails on all the CCOs out this week if we can. So you'll have a chance to feedback on that information, so the CCOs themselves have some time to receive that information before they come and see us next. Any other questions or comments? Councillor Bartley.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and apologies for lateness. Apologies if this is already raised somewhere, but how do we go about reviewing the CCO structure? Because I noticed Queenstown, they did a review and they decided to bring services back in-house.
Legislation.
I get asked this about every year or so.
So you've got the pat answer. Have you, Alistair?
Yeah. Essentially, if it's the combined will of the governing body to call for a review of the structure, we will undertake that review for you. We've done reviews of the CCO structure in the past. I think about 2014-15 rings a bell, where we considered is it most appropriate to deliver the services provided by the CCOs at arm's length, yes or no? If yes, are they being done by the right CCO? It is entirely up to you as a governing body collectively to decide whether or not you want to do that.
So my take on this, Councillor, is thank you for dropping that little pebble. I think that we need a discussion on that, and potentially, as Councillor Fletcher has outlined, potentially appointments, performance, the discussion maybe starts there and then comes here with a workshop for all councillors. But we can discuss that, no problem.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Any other comments or questions? Fantastic. We have a mover. Sorry.
I mean, I think in terms of a review, we did a thorough review in the last term, and that resulted in us merging Waterfront Auckland and Council Properties. So we did that review, and then now we've also folded up ACIL. So I think it's been an ongoing thing. I mean, I don't know whether it's timely for a whole new review yet, but I think it's worth looking at. I think
And
we
you've
had,
got, yeah.
we had serious concerns at the time, but also we were still a fairly new council, and we still are. So I don't know what the appetite is, but I felt that was a very thorough process at the time.
We have new councillors
Might be
and who are quite
slightly,
entitled to.
yeah, it'd be good maybe just to, you know, if we've still got that documentation, to let the new councillors have a look at that, because also the local boards were involved.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's very good. Councillor Darby.
Just a comment, because most of my have been questions, though there has been a bit of comment with my questions, I admit. So I would like the Auckland Transport one broken out from the A. And in my comment, Chair, I've grappled with this, whether to just support it in its deficient state or not support it today. And I've decided not to support the SOI for Auckland Transport in its current state today. And I reflect on the Regional Land Transport Plan initial decision, Mark 1 come Mark 2, and that was somewhat of an embarrassment to Auckland Transport, and of course that reflects ultimately on the council. So for me to support a statement of intent that is to outline the objectives and activities for the next 3 years, but it only outlines, and in a very deficient way, for the first 1 year, that fails to reflect the documents I listed before, the RLTP itself, the 10-year budget, the Auckland Plan 2050, a number of other decisions that the board and management have taken that don't seem to have been picked up here. The road safety strategy is a really important body of work. I'm actually almost embarrassed to read the forward by the chair in that SOI. It's all about congestion, and that we've asked Auckland Transport to address a lot more than congestion. In some ways, it just doesn't seem to reflect many of the conversations we've had with board directors around this table. It's really unclear what they're doing to improve the HOP. The ferry strategy was supposed to be at the July meeting of the AT board. Here they just say they're going to progress it over the next year, not confirm it. That's not enough for me. Same with the freight strategy. That's been kicked around for a long time. There's nothing in this SOI that says a freight strategy is going to be confirmed. There is concern I haven't had this question answered. There is an asset transfer from Ports of Auckland to Auckland Transport. It's not clear what the financial implications are. Is their budget being transferred from Ports of Auckland to Auckland Transport? That's not outlined. The roads and streets framework needs real explanation. I've had an email yesterday from Auckland Transport, but it's just due to emerging financial implications. The section on urban regeneration and placemaking is all about the greenfields area, not where we're finding out now 80 to 90% of the regeneration is happening in the brownfields area. Climate change, a total big, massive miss on Auckland Transport's part. Unlike Watercare that have reflected that, they've totally missed on our letter of expectation to address stormwater generation and sediment. And then there are a number of other supplementary items that they've also failed to address. So when I add it all up, and I'm asked to approve what my view is an unworthy statement of intent, I can't do that. I sit here in governance. I can't do that. So it's hard for me because I work closely with Auckland Transport, but in my view, it is not worthy at this time of supporting. It is entirely deficient. It's got a 1-year work plan. It should have a 3-year work plan. That's what an SOI is supposed to do. So, Madam Chair, I would like the Auckland Transport one broken out. I won't be supporting that. And I acknowledge Watercare and for Panuku for doing great work.
So thank you, Councillor. Look, as Chair, I think because I don't want to relitigate the conversation we've had, because this is very, very high level, because it was never going to be 100% accurate because of the timing of this particular round of the year, change of government, RLTP, Auckland Plan, all the things that we've said before. I think that B actually will cover your concerns. So I'm happy to leave the resolutions as they are, and you can absolutely able to note that you are voting against the Auckland Transport Statement of Intent, if that's what you would like to do. So without further ado, I've got a mover and a seconder. So all those in favour say aye.
Aye.
Against? Carried.
On the A, thanks.
Yep.
I'm against the
On
A
the
as well.
A Auckland Transport.
I would also, I'm recorded for A.
So Councillor Bartley, Councillor Darby and Councillor Fletcher, Councillor Hills and Councillor Sayers. And Councillor Watson against the A. I mean, sorry, A, just the Auckland Transport Statement of Intent. Yeah, okay.
No, it was Greg.
Greg, yeah, you're not me.
Oh, sorry, Councillor Sayers, yeah.
All right.
Wow.
So thank you. Thank you very much, Sarah, Ed and Alistair. We move now on to Ports of Auckland, and we've got Ella joining us, and Alistair.
Kia ora koutou. Not to be confused with the last Statement of Intent report, this report is to consider shareholder feedback on Ports of Auckland Limited's draft Statement of Corporate Intent. Just to note, the Statement of Corporate Intent has different timeframes and slightly different requirements. It's governed by the Port Companies Act, not the Local Government Act, hence why we see the shareholder feedback coming now. I also add that the feedback on this draft Statement of Corporate Intent is coloured by the fact that we've just taken ownership of Port start of July. So we've come to this process fairly late in the piece. I note on that in the future there might be an opportunity to front-end it with a letter of expectation or similar. With that context, I would also add that under the Port Companies Act, port companies do have an express obligation to operate as a successful business. All their other strategic objectives must be viewed in light of that. Through the chair, I'll run through the proposed shareholder feedback and then take any queries and questions from around the table. The first piece of feedback is around the objectives, so noting that the port's objectives should be aligned to Council's strategic framework as set out in Council's strategic documents. I would note that the objectives set out in the draft Statement of Corporate Intent do demonstrate a willingness to align to Council's broader strategies. The feedback is designed to ask the port to be a little bit more clear on which strategies it's aligned to. The next part was the key performance targets. There was a bit of departure between last year's draft Statement of Corporate Intent and this year's, so just requesting a little bit of clarification around that where appropriate. Next, we had the cooperation with Council. This was a bit of a theme throughout the Statement of Intent process, so considered it appropriate to request that the port make a strong commitment to cooperating with the rest of the Council group. Again, it's not totally absent in the draft Statement of Corporate Intent. However, they could be slightly more directive on that. Next is the mana whenua engagement. Council has obligations to connect up with mana whenua, and in the case of our other CCOs, we do direct them to develop Māori responsiveness plans in line with our Māori responsiveness framework. I would add that at an officer level, I've connected Ports of Auckland Limited up with Te Waka Angamoa, and those conversations are being had. However, considered it appropriate that the draft Statement of Corporate Intent should also indicate a stronger commitment there. The next piece of feedback was on Ports of Auckland's work with central government. So just making it really clear that central government are doing work in the port strategy and supply chain space. And I guess the point here is that ports should be clear that that relationship exists, and they should also be seeking to communicate frequently with Council on their work with central government in that space. The final piece of feedback was around sustainability. Ports of Auckland, in conversation, have demonstrated some of the work that they're doing in the sustainability space. Staff advise that this is something that we could really commend them on if only we could measure it. So we've asked them to insert some KPTs that can demonstrate their work in the sustainability space going forward. The only other note I would add is that recommendation C has been crossed out. Under the relationship agreement that the governing body adopted through the long-term plan with the port, there is scope to have an annual update from the port. We're still refining just how the format, content, and of that update. Hence, September might be a little bit too soon. Happy to take any questions.
Okay, I'll just to put it on the table, I'll move. Do I have a seconder?
Yes, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Questions? Councillor Cooper.
Thank you, Ella. Just in terms of the mana whenua engagement, you said at the beginning of your presentation that the ports aren't under the Local Government Act, but you've noted the Local Government Act here. Can you just explain how, then, what the relevance is of that comment?
Yes, through the Chair, under the Local Government Act, Auckland Council has obligations to the Treaty of Waitangi. That is the policy reference there that's set out in Section 4 of that Act. So while the Port Companies Act doesn't say that ports have a specific obligation, we consider that the council group, including the port, should be working with us to achieve those aims. Thank you.
All right. Any other questions?
Yeah, well,
So, Deputy Mayor.
thank you, Madam Chair. I noticed a lot of the reporting is historical on cash flow, whereas perhaps the port's biggest impact on us is future looking. So are we going to see things about their asset management program, their capital program, and how that may potentially affect dividend streams and so forth? So we have a bit of forward leaning on that. How is that going to be, I know this is new, so how is that going to be keyed into our relationship?
Maybe if we, Matthew might be able to give a bit more detail on this, but through a lot of the discussions that led into the disestablishment of ACIL and working out with ports how we would interact, one of the big focuses was on how they would input into our financial planning processes because of the importance of their dividend to us. So we've emphasised to them that it's really important that we get a good, accurate forecast, and given where we're at in relation to our debt limits, their capital expenditure is of particular interest to us. So the finance team and our financial reporting team, Ella did a wonderful job of chucking us all on a minibus and going down to ports and actually physically meeting up with everybody's counterparts down there and starting to build those relationships so that everybody can work together on those.
Sorry, Alistair. I would also add to that part of the feedback does ask for a bit of a clearer explanation on the difference in projections from this statement of corporate intent to last year's. Although I don't generally think that the statement of corporate intent is the place to give the really granular breakdown on projections. But we are putting those relationships in place so that those conversations can be effective.
So I take then, Madam Chair, it's a work in progress, but I still think it's important. Although it should not be part of the statement of intent, it should be part. What should be in the statement of intent is that they will do this work and report to us on their forward projections.
So that's correct. Yep. Matthew, do you want to add anything?
Well, just through the chair and for assurance, there have been good connections, and I've been working with the CFO there as well, to give you some assurance the numbers that are contained in here and in respect to capital expenditure based on their 5-year business program, it's very much aligned to the LTP numbers we're working with at the moment. So there's good alignment, and I think everything in their SCI here signals the way in which we'll work together, and we should not expect any surprises, and they'll be reaching out and keeping us informed.
Any other questions? Sorry, Councillor Darby.
Thank you, Ella and Alistair. Just on the page 200 of the agenda, 5.2, working for Auckland and serving New Zealand. The port occupies a footprint that is right in the heart of this downtown city centre area. There's a section there, Ports of Auckland will work cooperatively with Auckland Council and CCOs to assist in the delivery of outcomes related to the Waterfront Development Master Plan and Auckland Plan, Unitary Plan. The port has a major impact on the transport network, and I would expect them to also work with Auckland Transport on transport planning and transport solutions. Should we be adding that there? We know that there are already some things that need to be resolved with the port company, like a teardrop bus stop, and there's rail solutions, there's freight access, etc.
Thank you, Councillor Darby. Through the Chair, the shareholder feedback under the headings Objectives and the cooperation with the Council Group is designed to put the platform of that bigger Council Group picture specifically. So in terms of the cooperation with Council Group, we've asked the port to be clearer about exactly which CCOs they'll be cooperating with and which council strategies they'll be seeking to line up with. Within that, Auckland Transport is a specific mention there, and I note that under the broader objectives bit, we have signalled our strategic framework, that being the Auckland Plan, Waterfront Plan, City Centre Master Plan, Central Wharves Strategy. So we are trying to build a picture there, and I think moving into next year's Statement of Corporate Intent process, we'll be able to front end that and be a bit more pointed with the sorts of outcomes we'd like to see.
Well, could we do that now? Because there are some unresolved issues there that relate specifically to transport, and you're saying it's assumed, it's included. I would prefer that it's just a bit more specific.
Yeah,
the port has a major impact on transportation.
If you pass us those points, we will include those in the feedback as it goes back about those specific transport planning matters.
I think that's very valid. Thank you, Councillor.
Thank you.
Councillor Casey.
Yeah, I've just been revising the SOI in terms of delighted neighbours. We've got delighted customers, but there's nothing really much in here about being socially responsible, even though we ask them to be it. And their measure is to hold 4 community reference groups per year, but we don't know, are they being held, who comes, what issues are being discussed, are they a riot, are they kind of... I'd like to know more about those reference groups. But also, can we be a bit more proactive in being a good neighbour? The port being a good neighbour is really important. A delighted neighbour is even better. So if we have delighted customers, let's have a measure for delighted. And also, iwi and community are in the same box here, and I'm not sure that that's appropriate either. I think good neighbours quite different to having good relationships with iwi, quite different. So maybe you can have we look at that, and the next time they come in, they can talk to us more about what that actually means. And maybe have another target rather than just hold 4 meetings. What about lack of complaints from neighbours?
Yep. Thank you, Councillor. I've taken that feedback, and I'll incorporate that in advising ports when they come to update Council. I would note that just on the mana whenua comments, the feedback here is directive in setting out Council's obligations, and in conversation I have asked them to develop a separate measure because I think that's quite important.
Excellent, thank you.
Councillor, just by way of addition, I have attended one of the reference groups because they are neighbours, of the port, and issues such as transport and other things and noise do come up, and they do address them, so they do that quite well. But it would be really great for you to hear it from them as well. I mean,
go along to one even.
Yeah, the point is that you're not aware of it. Yeah, so that's very valid. Thank you for that. Councillor Fletcher.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. As most of you will know, I didn't support the disestablishment of the CCO, Auckland Council Investments. But that said, I just want to, and I've noted very carefully what has taken place as we have a transitionary regime, and I want to acknowledge Ella. I think she's done an outstanding job. Any questions that I've had have been fully answered, so I'd just like some recognition. This has been a real change for us in the way that we take accountability for this asset that is 100% owned by the Auckland Council. So I'd really like to applaud the professionalism with which she has brought this forward. So thank you.
Thank you. I think we can do that in an appropriate way. Thank you very much. I support that. I too didn't support the disestablishment, so I concur 100% with my councillor colleague on the way that, having made that decision, how this has progressed. So thank you. We have a mover and a seconder. All those in favour say aye.
Aye.
Against? Carried. Thank you. Now we move on to item 10, and in the open agenda with regards to the open process for the confidential item coming up a bit later, reacquisition in North Takanini for stormwater. We have Andrew Chin and Craig McElroy. No, we don't. We just have Craig McElroy.
Just the one of us today, Madam Chair.
That's all right. Quality, not quantity.
Colour.
And colour, of course.
So for this open agenda item, I was just going to take the report as been read. There's some issues around land acquisition which will require a confidential conversation, but I think the report is pretty self-explanatory.
Happy to move. Thank you, Councillor. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Sayers. Any comments, questions? No? Well, then we'll just leave it at that. All those in favour say aye.
Aye.
Against? Carried. Item 11, you might as well just stay where you are. Item 11 is, of course, the information only on the public record of memos and briefings of workshops held since the 19th of June. I'll move. Do I have a seconder on that?
Let him second.
Thank you, Afiso. Any discussion or comments? I'm sure you've all read it. Great. All those in favour say aye.
Aye. Aye.
It's carried. Thank you. So now I'll just, there's no consideration of extraordinary items, so I'll now formally move that the public be excluded as we move into confidential. Do I have a seconder for that? Thank you, Afiso. All those in favour say aye.
Aye.
Against? Carried. Just give us 5 minutes, please, while we get rid of the throws of people.